Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace, and welcome to today's Just Track Symposium on exploring alternatives to incarceration abroad. I'm David Yong. I serve as USIP's Vice President for Applied Conflict Transformation. I know it's a wonky title, maybe one of the wonkiest in Washington, the capital of wonk. But I wear this wonkiness as a badge of honor because this concept of applied conflict transformation lies at the heart of USIP's work. Let me take a minute to explain what I mean. Let me start with the compound noun, conflict transformation. Our vision at USIP is a world without violent conflict. Accordingly, our mission is to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflicts around the world. We try to do so by doing two things. First, we engage directly in conflict zones in partnership with local peace builders to link analysis, training, and field programming. Second, we partner with these local peace builders not simply to stop violent conflict, but to transform it through the building of new social contracts between state and society. That's why we call our work conflict transformation. Next, I'll explain the adjective applied. In 1984, as many of you know, Congress and President Reagan teamed up to establish the U.S. Institute of Peace. They did so because they believed that while the United States had great military academies, it also deserved a great peace academy. The lead authors of the legislation were two senators, Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon and Senator Spark Matsunaga of Hawaii. Both had served with great valor in World War II. Senator Hatfield in the Pacific Theater and Senator Matsunaga in North Africa and Italy. So in the 1984 United States Institute of Peace law, the senators wrote that the Institute would, quote, strengthen and symbolize the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. USIP was thus established to bridge theory and practice, to bridge the world of the researcher and the world of the practitioner in the field of peace building. My colleagues and I, in partnership with all of you, seek to build such bridges. We seek to create knowledge with you and to apply that knowledge to policies and programs. So you take one adjective and one compound noun, and that equals applied conflict transformation. That's what we proudly do at USIP, and applied conflict transformation is what brings us together today. We assembled this morning in partnership with the University of South Carolina's Rule of Law Collaborative and the State Department's Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. For several years now, the INL Bureau and the Rule of Law Collaborative have worked on this important Just Track project. Just Track stands for Justice Sector, Training, Research, and Coordination, and they do a great job in all three of those nouns. USIP has been proud to co-convene several symposia with our Just Track colleagues. So I want to thank now the leadership of the Rule of Law Collaborative, Professor Hamid Khan, Professor Joel Samuels. I want to thank also the leadership of the INL Bureau, and I want to thank Senator Lindsey Graham, who for many years on the Hill, first he initiated the idea of the Rule of Law Collaborative in his home state of South Carolina, and then for many years has provided support for peace-building, human rights, democratic governance, and the rule of law in his capacity as a senator. I'm also grateful for the contributions of USIP's Governance, Justice, and Security team, which is led by my colleague Philippe Leroux-Martin. I want to thank Philippe and his team member Chelsea Dreyer for supporting Just Track in today's activities. Given the importance of governance, justice, and security to the transformation of conflicts, we're very happy at USIP to be part of today's symposium. We meet today to exchange ideas on exploring alternatives to incarceration, even in the toughest environments. Over 11 million people around the world are held in penal institutions. In many countries, the rate of incarceration is rising. Overburdened facilities can accommodate neither the needs of the general prison population nor those of vulnerable populations such as women, children, and the disabled. Mass incarceration also impacts heavily the families and communities of prisoners. Under these conditions, prisons often foster recidivism and wider networks of criminality, especially for nonviolent offenders. Alternatives to incarceration offer a solution to this complex of problems. We also meet today because mass incarceration in many countries may contribute to the radicalization of certain groups. And when perpetrators of violent extremism are themselves incarcerated, penal institutions must devise ways to prevent the radicalization of fellow inmates. For those who have subsequently renounced terrorism and have served their prison sentences, justice and security actors across the board must work with community leaders and families to help rehabilitate and reintegrate those individuals. So the more lessons we learn in this regard and the more lessons we can apply, the safer and more reconciled these communities may become. In sum, the problems stemming from mass incarceration and the possible solutions offered by alternatives to incarceration are key topics in our current discourse on applied conflict transformation. Within this inspiring monument to the American people's commitment to global peace, I wish you today a fruitful discussion. I encourage you to build new bridges, new links between theory and practice in the worlds of learning and public affairs. I'd now like to introduce Hamid Khan. Hamid is the Deputy Director of the Rule of Law Collaborative. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Hamid is best known all around the world as a leading expert on Islamic law. And he has also served at USIP. He's also a National Security Fellow at the Truman National Security Project, and he's very involved with the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Consortium on Islamic Law, and he's also very involved in one of our networks that USIP leads, the International Network to Promote the Rule of Law. So with much gratitude, I now introduce Hamid Khan.
Thank you, David, for that very embarrassing introduction. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the U.S. Institute of Peace. Welcome to one of our offerings under the Just Track program, which today promises to delve into important questions that deal with incarceration and the alternatives that we intend on exploring today. As already mentioned, the Just Track program is a cooperative agreement between the University of South Carolina, and particularly the Rule of Law Collaborative, and our partners at the State Department. And as already mentioned, this is one of our constant deliverables, which composes of experts from around the world to tackle and discuss issues of great political and legal concern to the rule of law community. In addition to our symposia, there are typically 2 symposia that are offered publicly, and a closed-door invitation-only symposium in which we travel to various parts of the world to look at various issues of concern. We also offer various trainings. We extend our gratitude not only to USIP for their willingness to host our event today, but only 2 weeks ago they were willing to also roll up their sleeves and co-host an event that dealt with civil law legal systems around the world. In a few short weeks, we also intend to offer a training that will be led by myself that will look at Islamic legal systems And that will also be an opportune time for individuals both in this room as well as individuals in the broader policy community to delve into some particularly interesting subject matter. In addition to our symposia and our trainings, which we offer on a quarterly basis, Just Track also provides research opportunities, and we will continue this work through the benefit of INL in the coming years with the aim of trying to benefit practitioners in the rule of law and those who work in the justice sector with additional offerings of both training, symposia, in which hopefully all of you will be willing participants. To today's event, as you will undoubtedly notice, this is a rather novel topic, especially in the realm of justice sector issues abroad. However, it is not a novel issue for those of us in this room and those of us who are aware of the issues pertinent to the United States. So today we will bring together a collage of different experts, those both here domestically empowered as well as those abroad, to talk about some of the most important and salient issues that one can cover in one day. So it is with that, both extending the gratitude to USIP, to the staff at the Rule of Law Collaborative who have been assisting. Let me just note a couple of minor logistical details before we begin today. First and foremost, restrooms are at the end of the corridor. You are welcome to bring in your coffee at various times during the day. Lunch, the keynote address, which will be offered by the State Department, will actually be down in the lower part of the atrium, and then it will return up here for the concluding sessions during this afternoon. In addition, because we are, of course, always trying to better and improve our deliverables, you will notice that in the packets that you were given, there is a very colorful evaluation form. So I am duty-bound and honor-bound to remind you that if you have any complaints, concerns, but high praise, to please include them. So with that, let me introduce both an innovator in her own right, someone who has worked in the policy community on these salient issues, to introduce the topic of alternatives to incarceration and to lay the foundation both for the challenging issues as well as the work that they have done, Ms. Pam Rodriguez. Thank you.
Slides. I'll be fumbling forever. So good morning, everybody. Thank you. I want to thank Hamid and Dr. Yang and the Institute of Peace, INL, and Just Track for convening this and for honoring the work that we have done by asking us to open up the day for you all today. As Hamid said, my name is Pam Rodriguez. I am the president and CEO of TASK, Treatment Alternatives for Safe Communities. We're based in Illinois. We are an independent NGO. We are providing case management statewide to justice-involved populations, and we work at all points in the continuum related to people with substance use and mental health disorders. We connect. So in Illinois, that means we work in both very urban places, such as Chicago, but also very rural communities. And the services we provide are available to everybody in the justice system, whether you're in prison or in the courts and on probation. As I said, our core service is case management. We are focused on reducing incarceration, on reducing recidivism, and increasing the health and wellness and recovery for people who come in contact with the justice system. We have, in addition to being a service provider, though, we view our responsibility and our role to really change systems and to advocate for change in systems nationally and internationally. So in addition to the direct service work, a piece of our work has always been about policy advocacy and systems change throughout the world, really. And that's, I think, what that experience is also what brings us here today. We have been in business doing this work and doing advocacy since the 70s, pre-war on drugs, and have been doing international work for about 10 or 15 years. And so my comments today will be based on a combination of those experiences. Okay, so why are we talking about diversion and alternatives to incarceration today? Why does that matter? I want to just start by accepting the fact that, yes, incarceration punishes people. So if what you want to do is punish people, that works. And that's a given, and that's usually what people throw out as the reason for doing this. But what I want to say to you is what it does as well is it makes people worse. We think that we're increasing public safety by incarcerating folks, and in fact, there's a ton of evidence that suggests that we are making and increasing their criminality. 95, 98% of people who go to prison come home, and when they do, they bring risks back to communities, and we see that here today in the U.S., and we see it around the world. It increases the risk of recidivism, disconnects people from the supports that they have locally. It disconnects them from families. It makes them unemployable. It makes them hard to house. It makes them hard to reintegrate in families. And so the cycle of criminality and recidivism continues. So instead, we would argue that if we want to increase safety and increase safety in communities, we should really be focusing on alternatives to incarceration. That there are things that we know about how to serve and treat people in community that increase safety, increase health, and reduce recidivism. And that is not in question. There is a ton of research that supports that. So what we're really talking about is implementing what we know in the face of pressure to do the opposite, right? In the face of pressure to continue to incarcerate folks. The thing that often gets overlooked is that this also increases victim satisfaction when we do this the right way, and victim safety. And a lot of times people leave the victim voice out of these conversations when we talk about alternatives to incarceration, but in fact, if victims have a voice in what happens to the people who have offended them, they frequently want restitution, they frequently want an apology, and they are happier with the outcome than when people are just simply sent away and they don't know what happens and they're not involved in the process or the decision making. So it's also palatable in the victim community when done right. And by the way, we haven't always done that right, so I'm not suggesting that's an easy thing to do, but it's an important voice to remember. So the thing that we advocate for here and across the world is that every decision point in the justice system presents an opportunity to divert people. In the past, we have looked at diversion as something that is a diversion from prison. And that really is sort of the last opportunity we have to make that decision. In fact, we make many decisions about what's going to happen to people and with cases and charges at many points along the system. So at the point of arrest, police make a decision on whether to arrest or not and exert tons of discretion at that point in the process, touching the most people of anybody in the justice system. So law enforcement represents a huge opportunity to make a different decision about what's going to happen to this person and with this case. And so in this diagram, you see that's sort of the widest swath of people and the first opportunity we have to really make a different decision about diversion and alternatives. At the point of deciding whether or not to hold somebody in jail, pretrial is another point at which we can make a different decision about what to do with folks. And the subsequent slide will show evidence about even the smallest amount of time spent in jail increases a person's risk of recidivism. At the point of charging and making prosecutorial decisions about what to charge, how much to charge. We can make a different decision at that point. There's discretion all the way through the system that enables people to make different decisions about alternatives and not wait until the very end of a case and the very end of processing and the very final decision about prison or no prison. And you will hear system actors saying that they are limited in that discretion. But in fact, they are by law to some extent, but not as much as they pretend to be. I was trying to come up with a different word, but I'm just going to say pretend, okay? Because it's convenient to hide behind that, right? As opposed to actually admitting that they have tons of discretion on what they're going to do. And so the point of this diagram is really to visually depict how small, in fact, our system would be if we diverted folks at every point along the continuum. And what you will be hearing about today are things to do at these various points that make this a safe and viable strategy, reducing incarceration, reducing recidivism, and increasing health and recovery in community. Okay. So, what have we learned about who we incarcerate and who's incarcerated around the world, right? The people that we incarcerate, by and large, have substance abuse and mental health disorders. They're not all violent. They're not all murderers and rapists. They are people with substance use disorders who cycle through the system over and over until we get tired of them, and then we throw them in prison. And that's what we would argue, again, is that that's true in so many places. We can do something different with those folks before we give up on them, before we get tired of them and throw them away and lock them in prison. So if you look at these numbers, and they're kind of hard to see, but you have PowerPoints in your packet as well, that in the United States, the first bar, the first light gray bar, shows the general population rate of mental health disorders and substance use. Let me just say one thing quickly about mental health. SMI stands for serious mental illness, and that is bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorders, things that tend to involve hallucinations, delusions, and things like that. And then mental health writ large includes other things as well, like depression. You compare that to the jail population, where 50% of the population, instead of 18%, have diagnosable conditions, or 64%, I'm sorry, and 50% of prison populations. If you look at the substance use disorder one, it's even more stark. In the sense, the rate of diagnosable substance use disorders in the community is around 5, maybe 7% of the general population has a substance use disorder. If you look in prisons and jails, they are overwhelmed by people with those same conditions. And jails and prisons, are they treatment centers? Are they designed to provide treatment? Are they designed to provide rehabilitation and services that prevent this disorder from reoccurring when people leave prisons? Generally not. There may be some AA, there may be some NA, things like that in there, but those are self-help groups. Those are not treatment. They don't get medications for the disorders that they have. And when they are released from prisons and jails, they are also incredibly likely to return to use, even after forced detox. So, what are some of the lasting problems associated with it? So we've removed people from our communities. We think we're safer. We think we're happy to not see them anymore. And this is true internationally. People are mad at you. People are afraid of you, and they want you away from them. But you come home. And when you come home, what happens to you? We used to have this notion, here in the United States anyway, that if you did the crime and you did your time, you were done, and you could come home, reintegrate, get a job, I see, this is why I needed two hands free. Get a master's degree, go on and get a PhD, teach, do all kinds of wonderful things. And in fact, that does happen for a few people. But the reality is that a criminal conviction today lasts a lifetime. The internet has really helped with that. So even as you go and expunge your record and as you seal your records and all that kind of stuff, there's still tons of information out there that enables an employer, a housing provider, or family member to find out that you have, in fact, a criminal conviction. So you can't get housing, you can't get employment, your family isn't able to take you back in because you make their housing unstable, because now you're a risk to them. And so whole communities end up being destabilized. And this is true everywhere, right? The people who are impacted by substance use and mental health, the people who are impacted by justice involvement, come from concentrated communities of poverty, concentrated communities of deprivation, communities where resources have been either never there or pulled out of those communities. And those communities have been decimated. And so that's what that's who's incarcerated. The poor, people of color. In other countries, it's people of darker color or people of different religions, et cetera, that are targeted for incarceration. Their parents. One of the things that frustrates me immensely is that while 80% of the people involved in the justice system tend to be male, we don't talk about men as parents. We don't talk about them as dads. We talk about the moms and the women who are incarcerated, but the reality is 60+% of the men all have children as well. So we're taking parents and incarcerating parents. We're incarcerating people who have lots of health conditions. These are people who are coming from communities without a lot of good health care. So they've got chronic health conditions, they've got COPD, they've got diabetes, they've got high blood pressure, in addition to substance use and mental health disorders. So our prison system, not designed to treat substance abuse or mental health, is also not really designed to be a primary health care provider. And so, for example, if you need kidney dialysis and you're in prison, you will have a security guard drive you back and forth for your dialysis every day. And that takes up 2 or 3 people, and they're gone for the entire day for one person in dialysis. So the people in prisons get Alzheimer's and have dementia, and prisons end up managing that. Prisons often trigger mental health episodes and psychotic breaks. Additionally, people do get drugs and alcohol in prisons here and around the world. And so if you have an active substance use disorder going in, odds are pretty good that you'll be able to sustain that while you're in some prisons at least. So it's not even as if those are drug-free days, weeks, months, years that you've spent in prison. We have learned that even 3 days in prison increases the risk of jail, excuse me. Big difference in the U.S. The difference in the U.S. is that jails are state and county, or they're local, they're county run, and prisons are state run. Prisons, you tend to serve a longer sentence, at least be sentenced there for more than a year. Jails tend to do shorter sentences, but in reality, jails are mostly pretrial settings where people cycle through and wait for court. Even 3 days while you get arrested and wait for your bond hearing or whatever it is you're waiting for to make bond increases the risk of recidivism. So again, doing what we think is a public safety strategy, in fact, escalates the risk of continued criminal behavior. What happens when you get incarcerated? In jail for 3 days or more. You miss work. If you're there 10 days, you might miss your rent payment. Your employer might find out where you are, and you lose your job. There's all kinds of consequences just associated with those few days in jail. And it costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money. And doing the right thing costs less. So it's not just that it costs a lot of money, but providing adequate care in community costs less. So if you're not motivated by the human condition and the risk to community associated with incarceration, maybe you're a person who's going to be motivated by the financial trade-offs, right? So if a person is less risky when maintained in community, and if the community is safer and healthier, and it costs less, there's got to be an argument in there that pleases just about anybody else. It is why I said, though, in the beginning, if you want to punish them, prison does it. Okay, so that argument we can't defeat with cost and outcome kinds of information. Okay. So when we think about, then, designing systems that understand this and that address these issues, we start with thinking about each system, each country, each state, wherever you're at, with some kind of an assessment. Why? Because one size does not fit all. One size does not fit all. One size does not fit all. And so we want to encourage you to think about the local context, right? Whether it's a local context in so we've done stuff in South Africa, we've done stuff in Jamaica and Guyana and a bunch of countries, right? That local context is going to be different. So you start with a system assessment. You want to start where the country is at, not where you're at, and not with what we think. We know what the end is, okay? So I want to be clear that we have a vision for what the end outcome should be. But we got to start where the country and the system is at. And we want to know what kind of political will they have. That will vary, and where does it come from? We want to know what kind of capacity, and that capacity comes in the context of the capacity of the justice system, the capacity of law enforcement, the capacity of service communities, the capacity of community generally to think about responding to these issues and integrating people and doing something different than what is currently being done, which is incarcerating folks who, with low-level, nonviolent, probably substance-related issues. And when I say you build to a system strategy or a system response, that's the vision that we all kind of have in mind, and that's the vision that I laid out earlier, where we make decisions at every point in the continuum to divert people, right? That's sort of the end goal. That's the vision that we're working toward. But you don't start with that. You can't just build that, right? I mentioned the vision, diverting people at every point in the continuum. You have to have a systemic strategy or a system strategy, building the justice system's capacity to respond and building the service delivery community's capacity to respond. And that usually starts with a program or two, right? You don't want to stop at a program. A lot of people are very familiar with drug courts. We do a lot on recovery communities and case management. But you start somewhere with something that the country and the communities that can tolerate and can handle and can support, building to the broad range of systemic responses to people who come in contact with the justice system. It's my experience that trying it, having some success, breeds more success, right? Have some success, it breeds motivation to try additional stuff. If you start with a specialty court, you figure out, oh, you want to do something on reentry. You start with reentry, you realize you want to do something to stop the flow of people coming into the system. But the players and actors in the system kind of have to come to those realizations themselves. You help them, you build motivation, and you build their understanding. And the solutions, the strategies are all pretty clear and are all pretty well researched and laid out. It's just a question of building the system's capacity, and by that I mean ability politically as well as programmatically to respond to the opportunities that are there to do something different. So you start somewhere, start anywhere, start where they're willing to start, right? And then build on that. So one of the things, not up here, but that I did want to, that I think is important when you think about substance use and substance use disorders, it tends to be a good and easy way to get into systems and talk about alternatives and diversion. People are willing to talk about that. People with substance use disorders and mental health conditions are usually the primary targets that people are willing to work on. I want to confront or clarify a couple of myths or misconceptions. One is the myth that if you have a substance use disorder, you need to hit rock bottom before treatment works, okay? That is not true. That would be like saying, we're gonna wait till you have stage 4 cancer, right? Or we're gonna wait till the bridge falls down before we repair the bridge. Whatever metaphor matters to you, whether you're an infrastructure guy or a treatment guy or a doc, right? You don't have to wait till somebody is at rock bottom to intervene in a substance use disorder. The other myth or the other conflict that exists in this field that I think is relevant here is that coercion doesn't work, that people have to want to go to treatment. They have to want to become drug-free. They have to want what you're offering them. That's not true either. There's a lot of research that says using the leverage of the justice system to get people into treatment and keep them there is very effective. Now, the effectiveness part is that the justice system keeps you there long enough for treatment to work. Treatment still has to do its thing. It still has to motivate you. It still has to teach you new behaviors and attitudes and help you develop new friends and supports and social supports. But coercion works to keep you there long enough for treatment to work. Most folks without justice supervision walk out the door of treatment within days of starting it. And we need them to stay long enough for treatment to work, okay? So coercion on the part of keeping people in treatment long enough for treatment to work is very effective, and you don't need to hit rock bottom and beg for it and be at the end of your rope for treatment to work, okay? So some key principles, I already talked about treatment needing to be long enough to produce behavior change. The other thing I would say is that treatment should be individualized. Now, that's a hard thing to do in programs. So what we mean when we say that in reality is that an assessment should drive the treatment goals, okay? So just because I show up with a needle in my arm does not mean you know enough about me to decide and work with me to figure out what my treatment goals need to be, right? So you start with assessment in order to develop appropriate goals. One size does not fit all. Cookie cutter programs are not the best idea. Now, you have to have programs, so I'm not saying they're not structured and organized, but Pam is going to work on something different than David is and then Hamid is, okay? We're all going to be working on different issues. One of the things specific for justice-involved, these principles come from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and I want to highlight a couple of things. It's at number 4, it says treatment should target factors that are associated with criminal behavior. That tends to be peers and antisocial attitudes, as well, obviously, as substance use disorders. But that tends, in addition to substance use treatment, generally, for the health condition, for justice involved, we really need to deal with peers, attitudes, criminal lifestyles. The other thing that is very important when providing treatment to a justice-involved person is that the treatment team, the treatment staff, somebody is coordinating that effort with the justice system. The justice system has a vested interest in what happens with this person. They're under supervision. They need to know what's going on. That often presents problems for treatment because they don't feel like they want to cooperate with the justice system. And so At least in our case, we have a solution for that, and that is the independent case management that TASC provides, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But whether you have that infrastructure or not, the treatment system does need to cooperate, collaborate, and organize itself with the justice system in order to be effective. One of the easiest, or I guess two easy, obvious examples would be when the person leaves treatment against advice, the justice system needs to know that. If they disappear, if they walk away, they're AWOL, you need to tell the justice system. The other thing that happens is that the justice system often layers tons of obligations and requirements on people and deadlines, and those are almost always impossible to meet. You've got the conditions of a justice system involvement can be pages and pages of requirements that you and I would have an incredibly hard time doing, let alone also going to treatment. So in that case, treatment needs to be an advocate for more realistic timelines, expectations, and staging of all of those obligations and requirements. But again, the partnership is really important. Another thing that's super important, 3 minutes, I've got 3 minutes, okay. Here's a picture of what recovery over time needs to look like, or looks like in reality, not needs to look like. So having realistic expectations regarding what recovery looks like and what can happen when is really important. People are not magically changed overnight. And oftentimes our frustration and disappointment is related to that expectation. The other thing that's really important if you remember who I said gets incarcerated here and abroad, it is the poor. It is people with chronic health conditions. So it's really important if we're going to be effective in dealing with the population and helping them stay out of prisons and jails and out of the justice system is that we deal with other social determinants of health. It's really hard to maintain a crime-free lifestyle if you're homeless, period. It just is, right? So we have to deal with all of those other challenges that the population presents. This is not just a medical model that enables us to see the person 4 times a week and then we're done with it. So if we have all of these obligations and all of these responsibilities and expectations, how do we help this all stay together and make sense and flow? What ties the justice system, the treatment system, the housing system, the education system, the employment system, the family and the community together? What we advocate for is case management is the function for that. And more people are understanding the real value of case management and care coordination for complex populations and problems. So if you look at this picture is designed to just sort of convey all of the pressures, all of the obligations, all of the responsibilities that people who are touching the justice system need to deal with. And it is that chaotic and overwhelming and hard to navigate. This still shows all of the complicated and extensive obligations and requirements, but then also starts to make it look a little more organized and a little more manageable and a little more doable. And so this reflects a case management model and organization to the whole system and the whole process, independent of the courts, independent of treatment, independent of housing, aligned with the person involved in the process, aligned with the client or the patient or the person in the justice system. And there are the challenges and the benefits of that case management are listed here. But if you just think about for yourself the challenges in navigating complex systems, let's say the healthcare system. If any of you have had a complex health problem, you know how complicated it can be to get through that system. That system has case managers that help you through it. We're advocating for the same kind of strategy to help justice-involved folks. This model streamlines it a little more, makes it look a little clearer about the steps in the process from assessment to service planning to linkage and placement in those services, not just a, here are 4 housing providers, go find one. Here's a list of 6 docs, go find one. No, the case manager helps you get to and through each step in that process. It's also really useful in environments that are low resourced, because a lot of times a case manager sort of compensates for lack of resources in certain areas and in certain communities. And it almost doubles the retention in treatment. And time in treatment is what's necessary for people to succeed. And while I do believe that some of that is related to the relationship that is built between the case manager and the participant, I really think it's because the case manager also holds the system accountable for delivering what it has promised to deliver, and helps the person navigate those very complex systems. I'm wrapping up. Okay, I guess in a pre-conversation this morning, one of the things that one of your future speakers and I agreed on was the fact that we know what to do. These are not mysteries that need to be solved. We have evidence about what works in treatment, evidence about what works in the justice system. Even more importantly, we know what doesn't work, and yet we continue to do it. And what you're going to hear about today is examples of and people who have stopped doing what doesn't work and have started doing what does work. And that's what we're here to advocate for. Ta-da. Did I make it?
We'll go ahead and ask the members of our first panel to come up and begin their remarks. And then we'll have a brief coffee break at 11 o'clock. So we'll try to stay on schedule. Antonio?
Good morning. Well, thank you so much, Amit. Thank you for the organizers for this wonderful event. I'm very pleased to have these wonderful and knowledge people in the panel this morning. And I'm very pleased, Pam, that you were the one introducing the topic. Very pleased about that. There are many, many things that you mentioned that I'm sure we will be covering. And I work at the OAS, the Organization of American States, and we are particularly interested in hearing the whole range of alternatives to incarceration that we're going to be hearing to and experiences. But this particular panel that is about obstacles is something that we are confronting every day, and I'm sure you are in your daily work as well. Right now in this hemisphere, in the Americas, there are 15 member states, 15 countries that are either exploring or implementing, monitoring different alternatives to incarceration. Most of them are on the pre-trial stage. Most of them, they would love to do some more diversion programs, etc. But most of them, they're focused on the models that we know. However, you will see from restorative justice approaches to therapeutic justice in general terms, or drug courts, re-entry models, community courts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I know you have a lot of experience on these topics, and some of the. So what I would like just to keep this a little bit more active and dynamic. We all agree that we will have some kind of an interaction. Let's see how it goes. So we will do some kind of internal questions. It's not that we are, not seeing you all, but we're going to be asking each other things, and then we will let the floor for other questions from you. But if you, you have the bios of everyone. I'm not going to introduce them, but if we're going to do a short presentation about what we do in our everyday life in relation to this panel, and then we'll go into those questions. So. George, I don't know if you want to start from that end, but please.
We'll trust this is operational. How many of you started work in criminal justice before May of 1966? Can I see your hands? How many of you weren't born in May of 1966? So, okay, all right. In 1966, I'm a student at Iowa State University, and we were the Big 12 champions, not NCAA champions, okay. I had a psych professor who said, I understand you're interested in corrections. Would you like to go for an interview? I'm taking my son down. We're going to interview with the men's reformatory and the men's prison for people to be counselor trainees during the summer. I had such an admiration for this guy. If he had said, do you want to go clean hog houses on Saturday, I'd have shown up, all right? And so I started work in corrections in 1966. I arrived at the penitentiary short of money. Everything in my car said, I am here to be a counselor trainee. And the woman in the personnel office smiled just as you are right now and said, we don't pay counselor trainees. But because you're 21 years of age, you can become a correctional officer. You can work the 2 to 10 shift. And in the mornings, you can come in and volunteer to work with the counselors. Where do I get a uniform? I share this with you in that I came to community corrections having worked in 5 correctional institutions, starting as a correctional officer in a maximum security prison, working a cell house. I've worked from minimum security to maximum security. I've worked in men's institutions, women's institutions. I worked in a mental health JCAH accredited hospital run by the Department of Corrections. I have seen corrections from the institutional side before helping to design a community side. As was suggested by Pam, institutions are artificial communities. The warden is the mayor. They operate. The best institutions in the country will still be artificial communities. They are not the real community. And so as you look at, can we manage populations within the community, and how do we do that toward deliberate ends? That's the key issue from my point of view. We are where we are today not by accident, not by deliberate design, but we're not here by accident. If you look at institution populations from post-World War II to the early 1960s, the population grew gradually. From the 60s until the mid-70s, institution populations actually went down. When I went to work at the men's reformatory in 1971, after I came back out of the service, we had a cell block that was shut down. There was discussion of, should we actually knock the building down? A decade later, they were putting another floor in across the middle of that institution and double decking because the population was growing. If you look at the climb of the institution population, if you look at some of the public policy initiatives that we've taken, you will find that it's not an accident that the growth curve from the mid-1970s until the end of the decade is a rapid climb. And that we, quote, couldn't build institutions fast enough to satisfy the population. That people in Texas who were sentenced to prison never got to prison because they fulfilled their sentence in the county jail before they could get transferred to a state prison. That the federal government in the 1990s subsidized the building of prisons, not the operating, which is the true cost, but subsidized the building of prisons so that there would be more physical space and that people could serve longer sentences. Not because it produced a particular outcome that you wanted, but because it satisfied a sense of these people have done a crime, they ought to do a time. So my argument would be, as we look at this, you need to be very clear about what the outcomes are that we want that come for people who come through the criminal justice system, and whether that's the system that makes the most sense, whether those outcomes are achievable or not. See, we have accidentally, as Pam suggests, we have backed into the idea that if you're indigent, homeless, and mentally ill, the service delivery system for you will be county jail or state prison. That's not a deliberate decision, but it is a real decision. It is a real de facto policy. So I would conclude, Antonio, by saying I'm opposed to using the term alternatives to incarceration.
Is it working? Yeah. Thank you. And I forgot that we are recording, no? So this is the whole thing being recorded. So just for the record, and then this is on the paper, but it's live? Oh, good. Well, hello to all. Even better, even better. Well, for those who don't have the papers with them in front of them, George Kaisner is the Chief Executive Officer, Kaisner and Associates, and a former Chief of Community Corrections, National Institute of Corrections. Thank you so much for that introduction. We will go into that later on about the term of alternative incarceration, as it is a discussion as well. Next, it will be Fred Patrick, Director of a Center for Sentencing and Corrections, the Vera Institute of Justice. Thank you.
So good morning, all. It's a pleasure to be here, honored to be here. So I'm Fred Patrick. I work at the Vera Institute of Justice, which is a national nonprofit and research and technical assistance and policy organization. And our three core priorities include, for purposes of today, importantly, one, closing the front door to mass incarceration. Often when people think about mass incarceration, we sort of immediately shift to prisons and don't think about the overuse and misuse of jails in the first instance. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that matters later. A second core priority for us is the notion of ensuring that we have a sort of safe and fair and inclusive justice system in this diverse America. And that's dealing with everything from how we police diverse communities and how we, the role of prosecutors in the justice system. And then our third key priority, which also very much connects to our discussion here today, is transforming conditions of confinement. And that is for those who are in the system, for those who are in jails and prisons. How do we treat them? What do we expect to accomplish when we lock someone up? And that's very important because, as others noted today, 95% of all folks are coming home. And so if you think of jail and prison operations and programs as also part and parcel to alternatives to incarceration, because if you provide the right opportunities and do the right thing there, those folks maybe come home and never reoffend, so they don't come back through the system. So our overall mission at Vera is to drive change and to urgently build and improve systems of justice that are based on fairness and promote safety, and that also strengthen communities. And again, I think as we think about alternatives to incarceration, or whatever you may want to call them, it's important that you think about things such as human dignity, and how do we situate safety and strengthening of communities. And we think about individuals as our fellow members of society, as loved ones, as neighbors, as fellow members of that community. And if you sort of think about it that way instead of otherizing people and seeing them as something different or someone different, I think we could get to a much more humanistic approach to how we see justice across the nation. At Vera, we work in partnership with government. We believe that if you work closely with like-minded government officials at the state, local, and national levels, you can drive change from within, and you can sort of use your presence as a national organization the way Vera is, in partnership with communities and diverse perspectives to really drive change and, importantly, make that change sustainable. So our work, I should add, began in 1961. Vera's very first project was called the Manhattan Bail Project. Again, very important for us here today. And that is the two founders of the Vera Institute of Justice realized the injustice of the New York City cash bail system, in which people were being detained in jail simply because they were poor, and the injustice of that. And so they actually piloted a program which proved that if you allowed individuals who did not have the monetary resources but had strong community ties, if you released those individuals, they were going to show up at future court appearances. And so it's interesting because certainly here in America, as we deal with the whole notion of cash bail, which is now this sort of new reform movement, think about it. In 1961, my organization, the founders, had identified that then as an injustice and proved through empirical evidence that, again, people with strong community ties who could not afford bail could be released and they would return. So it's interesting because that story kind of suggests that a lot of the sort of movement towards justice reform and alternatives, it's not a new thing. It goes to show how much you got to really sort of lean in and stick with it, because that was 1961, and here we are in 2019, and there's a whole new wave of reform around the overuse of cash bail and whether or not it has a place in a society that believes in justice.
Thank you so much. It's funny that we are thinking that we are reinventing the wheel again in many ways. The next person in the panel is a person that I've been very pleased to work with lately a lot in some countries, is Michelle Vorowik, and I never pronounce your last name very well, even though we know each other, is the Chief Counsel of Treatment Alternatives for Safe Communities, TASC in Chicago. Please, you have the floor.
Hey, thanks, Antonio. I have the fortunate opportunity to follow Pam, who described quite a bit about what TASC does. So what I will say is TASC is a social justice organization, and as Chief Counsel, I have an opportunity to work within our operations and case management delivery, also with the policy and legislative work we do statewide and also nationally, and then our consulting, which is now, or has been, a global effort. A little bit about my path to TASC. I see George and I have something in common, which is psychology. My bachelor's degree is in psychology. I learned a lot about behavior modification. And actually, one of the jobs I applied for after I had my bachelor's degree and I was deciding what I wanted to do when I grew up was to work in a halfway house. And I did not get that job. They said I was too nice. So I figured out my path in life, and much to the chagrin of my psychology professors, I went to law school. I wanted to know the rules of society and how we can work within these systems. Went to law school, practiced law a bit. I was on the bench for 7 years, and I think I started to regain faith of my psychology professors because I worked in a municipal court, which is high volume. So a lot of the nonviolent offenders and just a lot of people that are struggling, and now they're in the court system. We started a poverty initiative. I've heard a lot of talk about poverty. We're not directly talking about that today, but we felt that if we address some of the poverty issues in the community, that would alleviate some of the people coming into a legal system, and that's not where they belonged in the first place. We formed a drug court. We formed a mental health court and also a veterans court. And it's amazing to see the transformation of lives within those models. So being the person that I was, I realized when you are forming these programs at the ground level, there's a lot of work that needs to be done upstream at the policy level to support them. And so I started realizing that there was way too much lifting for one small community to make things happen that needed to have some statewide effort. So I moved on to the Supreme Court. I was policy counsel there, and it gave me a chance to really look at departments and the coordination that needed to happen to have a multi-system approach. It was at that point that I met TASC, because one of the things that we pondered was opioid use disorder and the drug crisis does not respect boundaries or jurisdictions. It does not limit itself nice and neatly to your city or your county or your state, and quite frankly, or our country. And that's one of the things that as I've been able to do some traveling with Antonio and some of my colleagues in the audience, you know, we're seeing how we are all tied together in this issue. And so I'm really thrilled to be a part of today's discussion, because I think we're taking some of what we're learning here at home, and we don't have it all figured out either, and we're sharing it abroad, and we're seeing some of the unique adaptations that we need to do. Out of curiosity, how many of you are lawyers? Oh my goodness. Well, then most of you will know this, and I may see some head nods. For those of you that aren't lawyers, I want to give you a little insight as to maybe why our system ended up where it is. I told you when I went to law school, I promptly unlearned everything I knew about behavior modification. And that's true. I hear chuckles from my panelists. Really, when you look at our criminal code, in the court system, it's pretty simple. When you do something wrong, the idea is if you're punished enough, you will get the idea that you weren't supposed to have that behavior, and you will be deterred from any future conduct like that because you don't want the punishment again. And we see how well that's not working, right? You look at our jails, you look at our prisons, and one of the things that I talk about a lot to courts is that really the purpose of courts is not to incarcerate. It's to rehabilitate. It's to make communities safe. It's to reduce recidivism and crime. And my colleagues and my staff at TASC will also point out when I have the 10 purposes of the courts, one is to avoid the arbitrary use of government power. And so I don't tell that to the courts, so I will deny, don't tweet that comment. But it's something really important to think about, and it has relevance here and relevance abroad, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, that was a great intro. Thank you, the three of you. Let's go back in terms of implementing these alternatives, and go back to the name that the issue of the name. And I'm sure those that have kids know that whenever you name the kid, there's one of the big problems. And I don't know if you experienced that, but I did. Yeah, whether one name or the other. And in the international arena, this is something that we've seen. Is amazing, but we didn't expect that to happen. But every single time we go to a country, we dedicate a huge amount of time in how the kid is going to be named. And it's just, and sometimes that name really blocks the whole project, which is something that we didn't expect. And I'm glad that Jamie Lee from UNODC is here, because in Europe, at least on that side, they're talking about alternatives to punishment and not to incarceration, which is something that we at the OAS would like to take, but it's kind of difficult to change the wording now once you already accepted it. So changing the name is difficult. Anyway, why, George, did you emphasize on the name thing and disagree, please?
Well, again, I had the good fortune of the state wanted to pay some of us to go to graduate school. Obviously, times have changed. That would not happen today. And so as I went to graduate school, I was introduced to some really great mentors who were involved in a movement in the early 1970s to mid-1970s called the development of community corrections. And so one of the guys, a guy by the name of Bernie Vogelgesang, started the first LEA-recognized criminal justice community corrections program in the United States. And again, the focus was very much, keep in mind the time. We were post-Richard Nixon, we were post-Vietnam, there was a great deal of mistrust of the federal government, was mistrust of state government. The closer you could get the decision-making to the local area, the better. There were riots in the cities. And so during this turbulent time, there was a movement that that started to shift and to say, we can manage this population in the community. But quite frankly, we did not have the bodies of knowledge, we didn't have the research, we really operated very much by faith. And so I spent a lot of time marketing community corrections as an alternative to prisons and jails, particularly alternatives to prison. And I would trot out the fact that I'd worked in by then, 4 institutions. And so I knew what the prison side was like and was offering what the community side could be like. By the time I got to the National Institute of Corrections and spent 28 years promoting community corrections there, a couple of things had become a reality to me. One was what Michelle has just shared with you. It's not about just improving a particular agency or developing a particular program, but it's really when you can get the system, the actors who make decisions that impact each other, the prosecutors, as Fred said, the law enforcement people, as Pam said, the judges, the other system actors to come together and to agree on what the outcome is supposed to be. See, policy, public policy, not agency policy, public policy ought to tell you what and why. What do you want as an outcome? Why do you want it? If you do that, and now based on the strategies and the tools that we have available to us, we can disaggregate this big, large population that we say goes through criminal justice. And we can begin to ask the questions, do we want law enforcement, when they pick somebody up who's obviously demonstrating behavior through delusional behavior that is not a criminal justice issue but a mental health issue, do we want them to be able to deliver that individual to an agency that can meet that need as opposed to booking them in the county jail? That's a public policy issue. That's a systems decision. It impacts the economy. It means that county commissioners who are making decisions about how to spend tax dollars ought to be looking at that and deciding which option makes the most business sense. And so I would argue that instead of alternatives to incarceration, we're really talking about dispositional decisions. Whether it's sentencing decisions, release decisions, we're talking about decisions and decision makers needing to be looking for what's the outcome and what's the bodies of knowledge that best informs getting that outcome. Whether it's at pre-arrest, pre-conviction, or post-conviction. The last thing I would say to you about using the word alternatives, as you're driving down the highway and you see this road sign that says alternative to Route 462, have you ever taken that alternative Route 462? It's full of trucks and buses. The road needs repair. It typically is not the primary highway. I would say to you, for some individuals going through the criminal justice system, prison should be the primary highway. We do not know how to manage their behavior in a way that keeps them safe and keeps the community safe. That is a very small portion of the population. The vast majority of people we can manage in the community toward a deliberate outcome.
In that same line of thought and taking the alternate route, would you, Fred, think that alternatives to incarceration is disrupt the status quo in that sense, or is it something that helps resolve?
Well, it depends. I think too often what we call alternatives, I believe, are simply repackaging of the carceral state. Still heavily focused on surveillance and control, still bedded in the belief that people of color and low-income people and people with disabilities are incapable of living free lives and are incapable of thriving. And so often what we do is we fool ourselves into thinking that we're doing other dispositional options, when in reality we're taking the thrust of the carceral state, again, surveillance, control, and simply moving it to other places. Sometimes that's the home with electronic monitoring, what have you. Sometimes that's, unfortunately, sometimes that's drug treatment facilities, how we're very quick, for instance, to default to inpatient treatment as opposed to outpatient treatment, which can be effective for the right individuals and with the right level of care. So I think we have to, as you think about expanding or developing alternatives, it's important that you take a step back and say, are we really doing something that's different? Or are we sort of repackaging the same harm and the same dysfunction? And I would argue that more often than not, we're repackaging a lot of the carceral state, putting it in a different location, as opposed to radically transforming how we approach justice. We talk a lot about outcomes, and I would argue that a part of what we don't do enough of is think about who and what are the right inputs. To what degree do we involve the community in thinking about what true justice looks like? It was mentioned earlier that when you actually look at data, the polling of crime victims and crime survivors, many disagree with the system that we have. They think it's too harmful, it's too retributive, and not focused enough on rehabilitation. And by the way, the victim's voice is often missing from it. I mean, think about it. We have a system in this country, at least, where the state, the prosecutor takes over. And so it's the state versus Fred Patrick. You, the victim, don't really get a voice. You're rarely consulted by the prosecutor's office. And so I think what we need to think about is, as we think about alternatives and other things of that nature, I'm trying to find a better way to frame it. What are we doing that's radically different? How are we being transformative? Or are we simply moving it, to a prettier box, if you will?
Thanks so much. It's interesting. I have Mariano Montenegro is here from Chile and knows that some countries are taking restorative justice as the way to go forward. In Costa Rica, for example, in Chile, they do take the victim into account in the whole conversation on alternative incarceration. Interesting. You mentioned that you've been talking about that end, no? The prison end and the post-adjudication in a way. There is a, however, and you mentioned that in your introductory words, the whole thing of a drug court that you had in task that you supported in the beginning, and you being as part of a package, no, and that you have or counties has. In most of the countries in this hemisphere, we've been seeing that the most demanded model that it is the drug court, judgment court, with any names, and there's a lot of discussion about that. And yesterday we presented a monitoring evaluation manual for impact evaluation outcome, which is the interesting thing is that those models are taken because the legal landscape is there. Most of the countries have an easy way to go through that. Other ways is they need to change a lot of things if they need to go to diversion or not. And I mean, if you go into treatment in prison system, that's even another story. Who wants to deal with treatment in prison whenever you see how prisons are in some places? Your experience on that particular model, and I know you work in many others, but what are the main challenges that you see that you see in the United States or even abroad in your experience?
Sure. For those of you that I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with the drug court model, a couple things I want to point out about it, and we've heard from Pam, one size does not fit all. And so I think that's a really good phrase when we're talking about drug courts. When you need a drug court, when you're at high risk for recidivism, when you have a high need for treatment, this is kind of your last chance, and it's all hands on deck. It's a wonderful model, and it's transformative. There are drug court and problem-solving court graduations where you look at the picture at the point where they were arrested, and you look at graduation, and it's unrecognizable. And I will tell you that the judicial decision makers that implement that model and do it well, it's been transformative for them. and a little bit to the, does ATI, I'm not even going to say the words, does ATI disrupt or maintain the status quo? I think when done well, it does disrupt because it gives a voice to the person associated with the charges. We're not marching you through a legal system just based upon charges. So when drug courts are needed, they're wonderful, but it's not the only approach to take, even within a court system. And Pam showed the full range of opportunities all the way from pre-arrest deflection through the prosecutor, through post-conviction. But even with that court process, there are individuals that come into the court that are low risk for recidivism. They have low need for treatment, but they need something. And I've heard people time and time again comment, do we need to catch a felony to go into drug court? Do we have to wait until things are that bad before the court will move us into treatment rather than kind of the traditional disposition of a court case? So a low risk, low need case is one commonly seen in prosecutorial diversion. Where there's a need for education, it's more prevention-based, there are some light touches there, and that's all the person needs. If you want to help that individual and you make them do drug court for 18 months to 2 years with all the weekly court appearances, the treatment appearances, all the things that are mandated, it's really disruptive to the social determinants that are actually helping them to be successful. There are also models within the court system where you don't have high risk and high need, but you have one or the other. So if someone's high need for treatment, I think Pam mentioned the role of the court system is to make sure that the person is engaged in treatment long enough that they will be able to complete successfully. If you have someone that's not as high of a need for treatment, maybe a low need, it's going to be more of a corrections-based, where you're going to look at the factors that place someone at risk for recidivism that are dynamic or changeable, and that's what you want to address. So drug courts are fabulous, as well as all of the other problem-solving courts when they're needed. I would also say that when you look at developing countries, it's a heavy lift. My goodness, even if you look at rural areas in the United States, it's a heavy lift. And so if you don't have everything that gives you fidelity to the model, and if you don't treat person with the intervention that they need, you can actually make them worse. So what I would advocate for is to understand that, and Pam made a great point, wherever your entry is into ATI, it helps communities and systems, the treatment system, the judicial system or justice system, as well as community systems start working together. So you start where you are, what you can do and what you can do well. You address the target population that can be effectively helped through that system collaboration, and then you start building upon that to fill the gaps.
In that sense, that we've seen that, which is very interesting what you just mentioned. But the thing of everyone understands the high risk, high need is the profile, but it took like over 20 years in the United States to realize that. So there's a lot of time in between. When you go to a country where there is no prior communication between health and justice, there's nothing at all. This is the first time that you go into this kind of programs. It is kind of a challenging to tell a judge to really, or even the system itself, to take a high risk, high need to start with. Because they are not going to take that risk, that other risk, an institutional risk of having that kind of a profile. It takes. So often we go to countries and say that, and they say, well, we cannot go and implement the best model as you have seen in the U.S. after 20 years or 30 years of research. Sorry about that, we need some time. And it's kind of but that profile, we've seen that a lot as well. Fred, there is, why do you think alternatives to incarceration are important during the pre-trial and pre-adjudication phase?
So if we walk out here today, at the end of the day, and we see someone in handcuffs right out front, you're not likely to be asking, what did the police do, and why is that person in handcuffs? You're more likely to ask, what did that person do? There's an assumption there. Not that there was bad policing or a bad arrest, but that person must have done something wrong, right? And so think about the notion of individuals adjudicating their case while being detained in jail. So they're going to court in handcuffs, often in uniforms. And so when you see individuals showing up that way to adjudicate their case where presumably they are still innocent until proven guilty, you have that misperception or that perception that's pretty powerful. And by the way, the research, not only do you have that perceptual issue, but the research is very clear that a short stay in pretrial detention, as opposed to being adjudicating your case from the community, is more likely to result in a conviction. Your sentence, once convicted, will be longer than had you been fighting the case pretrial from home. And then after you serve your time, assuming you get an incarceral sentence, you're more likely to recidivate. So in every way, sort of being in pretrial detention is a bad thing and produces bad outcomes. And so it's important that as we think about ATIs, I didn't say alternatives this time. How about that? I'm learning here from my fellow panelists. So it's important as we think about it that we don't just automatically skip the whole jail apparatus and go straight to prisons and think about alternative dispositions for a prison sentence. But even as it relates to jail, why disrupt a person's ability to still support his or her family while they adjudicate a case, disrupt their support in the community, disrupt their employment? Again, if in most cases we're saying an individual still has a standing of being presumed innocent. And so it's very important that as you think about developing and improving and expanding these alternatives, that you don't just think about that prison setting. So I think they matter a whole lot in the jail setting. Again, the research is clear in terms of all the bad outcomes, likely to be found guilty, likely to get a longer sentence, and more likely to recidivate. That alone, I think, is powerful evidence as to why alternatives in the jail place matters just as much as on the post-conviction side.
In that same line, George, if we can establish a clear, concise, public policy targeted at reducing reliance on confinement, pre and post adjudication, what do you think are some of the most common impediments to accomplishing intent of that policy?
I can't believe, Antonio,
I did it.
that you said a clear and concise policy statement.
All yours.
See, I think that's one of the starting points is, can we articulate a clear and concise policy statement? Part of what leads me to say that is a British colleague, Stephen Pitts, and I had the good fortune of working in Armenia last fall. And unfortunately, there wasn't enough money in the budget to go on site and get a feel for the jurisdiction and understand the culture, understand strengths, weaknesses within the process. And instead they said, we'll send you everything you need to know. Well, yeah. So we received the law. And the law clearly, like many laws, was obviously written by committee. It was written by advocates for restorative justice. It was written by advocates for punishment. It was written by advocates for the use of what now has become evidence-based practice, because they required an assessment tool of the current generation risk and needs, okay? So you had a policy statement that was not clear and concise. It didn't speak specifically to what was this new state probation department supposed to be producing as an outcome, so we could measure whether or not we're just repackaging or whether or not we're actually producing the desired outcome. So even if you can get the concise statement, there are three things that I would share with you this morning that I think are important to keep in mind for implementation. First is the vision of the creator of the public policy statement frequently is not the person or persons that have to implement the policy. And the vision of the creator is frequently not the vision of the implementer. And so in Armenia, there were some very smart people who came together to write this law, and some very smart people who frankly came out of the Ministry of Justice and out of the prison system of Armenia, who now had to take a reduced salary lose part of their retirement, lose their uniform, use their recognition, lose their status in life to implement something that they had no background for and had no vision for. And so keep in mind, if you are creating a better universe and you know that what you're doing is the right thing to do, keep in mind who's going to make it happen. The second would be the issue of new staff versus old staff. About every decade in the United States, from 1970 up to the end of that century, about every 10 years, we had a shift in public policy or values within the community side of things. We went from, quote, rehabilitation in the 70s to probation departments that wanted to look like law enforcement in the 1980s, right down to getting uniforms that look like law enforcement, getting cars with bar lights on the top. One state even went so far as to get their probation system classified as a Class A law enforcement agency. You hire people at a point in time. If they stay with your agency, they were brought in on a set of values. Now, 20 years later, you're saying, Fred, the values of the organization have changed. We have a new mission. And you, who have been doing something for 20 years, you'll have to do it differently. And then Fred goes back to his staff and he says, you should have heard the goofy stuff I heard this morning. So keep in mind, even if you write a new policy and a new direction, if you bring new tools and tactics, new strategies, you've got to bring staff along. Behavior change for the people going through the system comes second to the behavior change of the people who are working the system. And frequently that's easier done with new people than people who you're trying to retrain in that process. Finally, expectations of implementation. Frequently, outsiders who are trying to change the system have expectations that things need to change immediately. We ought to see, at least within the first year, dramatic shifts in the number of people who are going to prison. We ought to see dramatic shifts in the number of people rearrested, going back through the courts, what have you. As Michelle shared with you, behavior change is a long process. It takes time. It is hard work. It is a heavy lift to do that kind of thing. And it has to be very disciplined. If you take the model for which there's a great deal of research and don't implement it correctly, there's no reason to expect good results. And so there needs to be a tension so that we continue to make progress and we get pushed and we're held accountable. But by the same token, the expectations need to have reality built into them so that we can celebrate together those accomplishments. The last piece I would share with you, and it ties to what Fred is saying, is, and also what Pam shared with us before, it's not just about keeping people out of prison or out of jail and keeping them in the community. We have people who would prefer to avoid some of the alternatives we've created in the past because it takes them longer to satisfy their legal requirements than if I just did time. In the 1980s, there were a lot of people who said, just give me my sentence, I'll do my time. I don't want probation because I'll have all of the rules that Pam talked about, and I'll get trapped in those rules, and a year later, you'll still make me do all of the sentence that I would have done before. So I'll just do it up front. Those conditions need to be tailored to what puts the person at risk. Needs to take into consideration what strengths the person brings to the system. that takes advantage of the healthy things in the person's life, but also honestly recognizes the unhealthy things. We used to think we just need to keep everybody close to their family. Well, no, we don't. There are some families that are pretty darn unhealthy. And keeping that person connected to them is probably a risk factor. And so we need to be very smart about how we do that case management and how we apply those kinds of knowledges. What we don't want to do, as Fred says, is just restructure all of that confinement to the community. We want to get people to be able to focus on the behavior change that allows them to live their life in the community independent of the system and not coming back to the system. Last anecdote I got to share with you, because we do things with the best of intentions. We worked a systems project working on reducing the incarceration of women offenders in Cook County, Illinois, with a great systems group, prosecutors and judges and probation and all kinds of good folks at the table. And I was going in for a visit, and I had been told that one of the judges had created a parenting class and was requiring women who had children to go to this parenting class as a condition of probation. And the probation department was having real problems with this. So as I'm visiting with the judge, and I said, I understand you have a new parenting class. And she said, yes, we do. Do you have time to go take a look at it? And I said, well, I don't this trip, but maybe in the future. And I said, hey, by the way, do you make that a condition of probation? And she says, yes, I do. And I said, so if a woman doesn't show up for parenting classes, is that a violation of her probation agreement? Well, yes, it is. Would you expect the probation department to file a revocation report? Yes. Would you consider returning her to jail? Well, yes, I would. Now, there's no child abuse in the original charge. There's no indication that this is a bad parent. And like me, we could all use improved parenting skills. But so I said, just a hypothetical. So what if she had a co-defendant, and the co-defendant happened to be a man, okay? And the man happened to be the father of those children. She said, okay. I said, she said, stop. I see where you're going with this. If you go any further, I'll hold you in contempt of court. And she said, so creating these conditions could mean that we would be incarcerating more women rather than seeing fewer women. That ceased to be a probation requirement that day. So we need to be, even when we think we're doing good things for people, we need to be thinking about what are those unintended consequences.
Well, that was, even the anecdote itself was very clear and concise. Thank you. All of both.
Not concise.
Yes. Well, the last thing you mentioned with the anecdote, it has to do with training as well, and resources, and how you train those resources. And I'm very glad that you highlighted those two elements in the beginning about rotation or people changing. And that is, I mean, any of you, and you mentioned case management. I want to ask you a question about case management now, Michelle. But there is one of the things that we've been seeing country after country is, and even ourselves, I mean, our own institutions, is the rotation of people. You train people, they really know what they're doing, and then 3 months later, 1 year later, then these people are moved to another place, and you have new people. You didn't train these people, and they do the best they could. At one time, I talked to a chief justice and said, well, why don't you keep the same person for 3 years in this particular pilot? And he said, well, if I do that, I will be punishing this judge, because then that judge will not be able to go up in the... So it's kind of any comments on that you've had on that kind of institutional capacity obstacle in terms of rotation or the turnover of...
So I worked for many years in city government in New York City, Deputy Commissioner in the Department of Correction, Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, and other things. And one of the things I think you have to think about as you build structures and is how do you incentivize what you want? And so how do you avoid the notion of someone being punished for doing a good job by moving them on to something else or keeping them there because they're doing a good job? And so you have to think it through. As an example, when I worked in NYPD, New York City Police Department, the police commissioner there was very focused on building community affairs and building police community relations. And I sort of said, have you ever given someone a gold shield, a detective shield, for doing great work around community relations? Because I know that everyone who gets detective shield, a gold shield, which is every cop's desire, if you had a lot of arrests, particularly felony arrests in New York City, there was a clear route to that gold shield. Again, the thing that suggests that you are doing a great job. But if you want to go into community affairs and you want to build that, there was no route to a gold shield. So think about what you've incentivized. You've incentivized the notion of go out and make felony arrests all the time. But if you want to spend your time as a youth officer working on youth police relations, or if you want to spend your time working on community affairs in terms of working with the community to build that relationship and that trust, there was no route to a gold shield. So there, unintentionally maybe, but look at the incentive structure you've built. And so I would urge you all to think about how do you, in every aspect of your system, how do you reward promotions? How do you reward merit and pay increases? How do you incentivize good training all throughout? Those things, we kind of take them as secondary. We're so focused on, these other outcomes, we don't think about the basic implementation things, which is the training, the incentives around promotions. What do you get rewarded for? What do you get demerits for? Those are the kind of things that you have to really spend a lot of intentional effort focused on. It doesn't come easily and naturally, and then you're trying to retrofit it after the fact. But that's a good example. By the way, I was able to convince that police commissioner to begin rewarding gold detective shields to police officers who were focused on community affairs and youth services. But it was very important that he had this wonderful institution, NYPD, with lots of smart people, just hadn't thought it through. So that's an example, I think, how you have to push institutions and constantly ask yourselves and your systems and your institutions, are we incentivizing and prioritizing all the things we really want? Do we take our mission and ensure that it's infiltrated through all aspects of operations?
Thanks so much. I'm going to ask the last question, and then we go to any questions that there's on the floor. You mentioned, George, about case management, and Pam dedicated some time in her presentation about case management. We've done in CCAT OAS, we just did 6 country evaluations on process evaluation, how they're implementing some of these alternatives with the cooperation of I.C. Arnold from Center for Co-Innovation in New York. One of the things that you can highlight across countries when they implement a model is the lack or weak link of how do you follow the whole process as a case. When you talk to a judge, case management is one thing. Then that name again, back to the names, case management means many other things from the other end of social integration, etc. Michelle, what do you think the role of case management is in the whole concept of ATI?
And the next panel gets to decide what ATI now stands for, since we are not using alternatives to incarceration. Well, when we consider dispositions of legal cases, you need a lot of information. So we keep talking about you need to know who's in front of you, right? So arraignment day, I can tell you there were lots and lots of complaints, and you call up the name and you advise the charges against you and maximum fines and penalties and review rights. But at that point in time, when I made my first judicial decision, I didn't really know what I needed to know about that individual. Does this individual do kind of justice as usual, or does this individual need something different? So case management plays a lot of roles. Pam did a great job of talking about it. There are materials in your folders, so I'm just going to pull out some examples of case management without trying to answer everything. But if you have case management in your court, it allows you to get some clinical information, some screening. Do we need to spend time with this individual and learn more about them? What do we need to know? A full-blown assessment. What is there a substance use disorder? What are the primary substances? What are the implications of that? How severe is a substance use disorder? What is the ASAM level of care? That is huge. And I think we heard a conversation about, are we putting people in residential treatment? And that's kind of another form of keeping them away from society. I'll tell you, as a mom, if my child had a substance use disorder, I would want to gently hand my child over to a treatment provider, have them encircled in bubble wrap. I would want them to promise that nothing bad will happen until they're all better and I can go ahead and parent them at home. When you're on the bench, the community is asking you, please keep this person safe and keep us safe from any of the activity that we don't want to have happen. So we can't use that as our default reaction. There's not enough residential treatment. We don't pay for it very well. If you're uninsured or have Medicaid, there's no financial way of sustaining that. And for many of the individuals coming into the justice system, it's just not the right level of care. So the case management can help share that information with the justice system. Make sure the person has proper treatment, monitor their progress, but it's not all about treatment. It's about the social determinants that promote and sustain recovery. What is your housing situation? We talked about maybe initially being with your family is not such a good idea. And it's challenging to find good housing. Yep. We have lack of treatment, we have lack of housing, we have transportation challenges. A number of individuals don't have full education. They may have limited employment opportunities. And if we have a post-conviction model, now they are saddled with all the collateral consequences that go along with that. So case managers understand how to navigate the legal system. They understand the information the legal system needs. Sometimes we have a little bit of treatment that we provide, and the treatment providers love to give a really long narrative of what you would expect to hand off to another treatment provider, so they fully understand the case. If you give all of those details to a judge, as smart as judges are, as well-meaning as judges are, they don't know what to do with that information. But the judge does know that the law requires me to make these 5 findings of fact, and depending on which way those facts go, I have perhaps some expansive, but perhaps some really limited options of what I'm even allowed to do, even if I feel that I want to do the right thing. So case management helps translate information between treatment into the justice system, between the community and the justice system. And they help, not only do they translate the information, but they can serve as a resource to make sure that information is used appropriately in a way that advocates for the client. So if there is a relatively minor program violation, the knee-jerk reaction should not be jail. And so they are the ones that are equipped with the information and the resources to have a clinically and therapeutically appropriate response to whatever the deviation is. There are all kinds of theories about that, but I wanted to just give you some examples that are touching upon the themes that were developed. Case management is much more than that. When you hear the term case management in a court, it's probably what probation is doing. Are the fines and costs and fees all paid? Are you showing up for your probation appointments? Are you doing clean drops? Okay, that's what probation departments initially look at. Some of them are getting more into the Southern model, but not always, and we can't make that assumption. If you look at case management from a treatment perspective, many of them will say, we do case management. They're primarily looking at within their organization, what is the appropriate level of care? How is my client progressing through this treatment level of care? And do we need to adjust it upward, downward, or do we need to have other services on board? If the patient, if the client does not show up for treatment today, they're probably not going to find a ride for them next Tuesday, right? And so this is where case management makes sure that none of this falls through the cracks. They keep the systems engaged with one another And sometimes if you have a problem-solving court, the court can help do that. It's a pretty robust model. For these other models, you may not have the point person that's making sure that everyone is on tap. And I think Pam used the word accountable, and that's exactly what happens. You have someone tying all this together. I would also note that research has shown it makes a difference. Pam gave some data from TASC. It is a best practice standard. The TASC model specifically is cited for adult drug courts, and SAMHSA has shown that this kind of specialized case management that we're describing here is a promising practice for both mental health and substance use disorder.
Thank you so much. We will need days and days to talk about all these topics. I know we have 5 more minutes before closing, or 2 minutes. I was going to open the floor to either, if we can get like one question, and then do we have a second just to say one word of closing, just one word each of the panels, or very one word message, a strong message?
There's the rule of law and there's the rule of Bible.
There you go. There you go.
And there's caffeine that we are standing between everyone and their caffeine, and we won't even touch that addiction.
There's a question over there. Yes, please.
Well, we've really focused on what we're capable of here. But in exploring the approaches to alternatives abroad, it seems to me that the wise exercise of discretion, police, prosecutor, judge at an early stage in the proceeding, is so critical to at least get more people out of this pretrial detention, let alone going on to, serving the sentence that's imposed. But in societies where all those actors in the system are suspected of, and perhaps even appropriately suspected of being corrupt, where even good people are afraid to exercise discretion because their wise discretion will be assumed to be a corrupt release or diversion of a person out of the system, what do we do about that most fundamental barrier to being able to move in this direction at all?
Take that, Fred.
So, I think a part of it is how do you sort of get beyond the punishment lens of justice systems in most places? And so I was overseeing a project at Vera called Reimagining Prison. And we realized it was very difficult for a bunch of adults to get in. We had all these roundtable discussions, and we wanted to kind of do blue sky thinking around how you reimagine. It was interesting, but most of us were so baked into this system as we know it, we really weren't reimagining. We were sort of tinkering at the edge, and it took some doing. And someone I'll never forget from one of the focus groups said, we should probably just get a bunch of 8 to 10-year-olds in a room and have them think about what you should do for individuals who you feel sort of broke with the norms of community. And they, without all of the trappings of this punitive system, would probably do a better job of building from scratch what a radically different approach would be. And so I say that not in jest. In reality, I think one way you kind of get beyond all the troubles and impediments of the current system, including corruption, is to go outside that as you think about what an alternative approach might look like. And it may be that it's the youth that can kind of do a better job of building from scratch this different approach.
Any comment in closing as well?
Yeah.
Brief, very brief.
Brief.
We're in trouble.
I want to shift that comment a little bit and give an observation. I will use law enforcement as a way to show just the lack of system capacity in countries. So you can imagine treatment and levels of treatment, lack of capacity. But I want to use a law enforcement example because I think there are some good takeaways in terms of just starting where systems and countries and people are, right? So we're traveling and we're talking about alternatives to incarceration, the opportunity for pre-arrest, and certainly corruption was one of the challenges. But then we looked at even wise use of resources. We've talked a lot about how individuals benefit from alternatives to incarceration. The systems benefit too. So we were in a country and we were invited to a meeting, and there were a lot of cases that were filed in the courts and being dismissed. And that was a challenge for public safety and justice and law enforcement. And so they were having a meeting to kind of walk through this. We learned that the law enforcement officers are not well paid. There's high turnover. By the time you have a case involving law enforcement, they're not working there anymore. They don't have a way to be paid, and they're expected to put on their uniform and carry a gun and get on the bus with the people that they are in the community with to get to court. And so it's not surprising that they don't often show up. There were also cases being dismissed because the evidence wasn't fully developed by law enforcement. We learned that this country was in a crisis, and they decided that you would no longer need a warrant to gather evidence. And now that the crisis has subsided, the warrants are now required, but for the past 14 years, and we talked about high turnover, for the past 14 years, you didn't have to go get a warrant and dot the I's and cross the T's for evidence. And so the burden for law enforcement to prepare the court files in a way that would be appropriate for the justice system was huge. When you look at alternatives to incarceration, especially as early in the system as possible, if you have someone with a nonviolent crime, they're not a danger to the community, and they need treatment, we can have a better use of resources by letting law enforcement and courts focus on beheadings and some of the really violent crimes that they have. Again, meeting the country where they are and realizing that alternatives to incarceration can actually promote better and more effective use of the limited resources, again, meeting the countries right where they are.
Briefly.
Content without context equals chaos. Content plus context can equal creativity. Because no one size fits all, what you've got to look at in each of those individual countries is there any credibility any place within society, and how do you then reinvent or restructure or invite people to the process that by their presence they give some hope of credibility to what you then begin to build.
That question is the question in many ways, and we at CCAR, when we go to countries and deal with alternative incarceration, that is a big issue, and I don't want to be simplistic, but in the opening remarks of Joel Samuels, he said we're about public transformation, and I think this is a cultural transformation, and the very simple start point that we have is just have cultures and sectors that do not normally talk together talked for the first time and just talk the same language and have justice talking health and health talking justice. That is something that we started. It takes a long time. It takes forever, as you all know. But that is even simplistically, but that is the answer I will give to that. And I think we have no more time. I just wanted to ask for a big round of applause for these wonderful three panelists. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity.